The morning dew clung to the tall grass as Danny O'Connor trudged behind his fraternity brothers, adjusting the heavy backpack digging into his shoulders. At 19, Danny was the youngest pledge of Sigma Alpha Mu, his slight frame and bookish demeanor standing in stark contrast to the boisterous confidence of the upperclassman who led the way through Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest. The camping trip, billed as a brotherhood bonding experience, had seemed like a good idea 3 days ago in the comfort of the frat house common room. Now, 2 hours into their hike with aching shoulders and sweat trickling down his back, Danny was questioning his decision-making abilities. "Keep up, O'Connor," shouted Brett Keller, the fraternity president, his voice carrying through the dense canopy of maple and oak trees. "We've got another mile before we reach the campsite." Danny forced a smile and quickened his pace, his hiking boots, purchased just last week and still stiff against his heels, crunching against the fallen leaves and twigs that carpeted the forest floor. He'd never been camping before, not really. Growing up in Philadelphia, his exposure to the outdoors had been limited to city parks and the occasional day trip to the Jersey Shore. This expedition into the heart of Allegheny National Forest represented uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. When he'd arrived at Western Pennsylvania University last fall, Danny had been determined to reinvent himself. In high school, he'd been the quiet kid who aced AP Calculus and academics, community service. What he hadn't mentioned was his desperate desire to belong, to be one of the guys for once in his life. The pledging process had been grueling. Late nights, memorizing fraternity history, completing increasingly absurd tasks for the amusement of the brothers. But Danny had persevered, and when he received his bid, the sense of accomplishment had been intoxicating. Now, as an official member, he was determined to prove he belonged, even if that meant hiking through the wilderness with 30 pounds of gear strapped to his back. "You doing all right?" The voice came from beside him, and Danny turned to see Mike Russo, a sophomore engineering major, and one of the few brothers who'd consistently shown him kindness during the pledging process. Mike's dark hair was pushed back under a UPW baseball cap, his olive skin already taking on a tan despite the dappled shade of the forest. "Yeah, just not used to the pack," Danny admitted, adjusting the straps once more. Mike nodded sympathetically. "First camping trip? That obvious, huh? The brand new boots and the way you're carrying your pack like it might bite you were pretty big clues," Mike chuckled. "Here, let me help you adjust those straps. It'll distribute the weight better." Danny stood still as Mike worked on the backpack, instantly feeling relief as the weight shifted from his shoulders to his hips. "Thanks, man. No problem. Just stay close to me this weekend. These trips can get a little intense." Mike's expression suggested there was more to the story, but he didn't elaborate. The path began to narrow as they moved deeper into the forest, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming a cathedral-like ceiling overhead. The late April sun filtered through the new spring leaves, casting dappled shadows across the trail. Despite his discomfort, Danny couldn't help but be impressed by the beauty surrounding them. The forest felt ancient, primordial, a place where time moved differently than in the bustling world of campus life. "This is the heart of Black Bear Country," announced Brett, pausing at a fork in the trail to consult a map. "Last spring, a hiker spotted a female with cubs not far from our campsite." A murmur went through the group of 15 young men, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Black bears aren't usually aggressive," said Tyler Johnson, the fraternity's resident outdoorsman, his lean frame suggesting years of hiking and climbing. "But they're curious and opportunistic. That's why we need to store our food properly and keep a clean camp." Danny felt a flicker of unease. Bears had been an abstract concept until now, something seen in nature documentaries or at the Philadelphia Zoo, safely behind barriers. The idea that they would be sharing the forest with these powerful creatures made the wilderness suddenly seem less welcoming. "Scared, O'Connor?" The question came from Jason Reed, a junior with a perpetual smirk who'd taken particular delight in making Danny's pledge semester difficult. "No," Danny lied, squaring his shoulders. "Just listening to the safety briefing." Jason snorted. "Safety briefing, right. Just don't wander off alone, freshman. Wouldn't want Yogi to mistake you for a picnic basket." Laughter rippled through the group, and Danny felt his cheeks flush. He'd spent his entire pledge semester as the butt of jokes, always trying to prove himself worthy of inclusion. This weekend would be no different. They continued their trek, the trail gradually inclining as they moved higher into the hills. Danny's calves burned with the effort, and his water bottle was half empty already. Just when he thought he couldn't go much further, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing nestled against the side of a hill. "Home sweet home for the next 2 days, gentlemen," Brett announced, dropping his pack with a heavy thud. The clearing was about the size of a basketball court, ringed by tall pines and hardwoods. On one side, a small stream gurgled over rocks, providing a natural water source. The ground was relatively flat, perfect for pitching tents, and a crude fire pit of stones marked the center of the space. "First order of business, set up camp before dark," Brett instructed. "Tyler, you're in charge of tent assignments. Mike and Carlos, get started on the fire pit. Jason and Kyle, let's rig the bear bags for food storage. Everyone else, start unpacking and finding level ground for your tents." Danny stood awkwardly for a moment, uncertain where he fit into the plans. Tyler approached with a clipboard, assigning tent partners. "O'Connor, you're with Mike and Carlos in the 3-man tent," Tyler said, barely looking up from his list. Relief washed over Danny. Sharing a tent with Mike would make the weekend more bearable. Carlos Mendoza was quiet but friendly, another sophomore who seemed to float on the periphery of the fraternity's social hierarchy, much like Danny himself. As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Danny found himself helping Carlos unpack the large dome tent. "Ever set one of these up before?" Carlos asked, spreading out the ground top. "Honestly, never," Danny admitted. Carlos smiled. "Me neither. My family was more into hotel vacations than roughing it. Guess we'll figure it out together." Working alongside Carlos, Danny began to relax slightly. Maybe this weekend wouldn't be so bad. After all, they managed to erect the tent with only minor difficulty, securing the rainfly just as Mike joined them, having finished his work on the fire pit. "Not bad for city boys," Mike commented, inspecting their handiwork. "Let's get our sleeping bags set up inside before dinner." By the time they'd organized their sleeping arrangements, the sun was beginning its descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the campsite. Tyler and Brett had a fire crackling in the pit, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. Jason and a few others were setting up a cooking station, unpacking camp stoves and pots from their packs. "Dinner tonight is chili and cornbread," Brett announced. "Tomorrow morning, pancakes and bacon. We'll have sandwiches for lunch both days, and tomorrow night is the traditional Sam camp-out feast, steaks for everyone." A cheer went up from the group. Danny hadn't realized how hungry he was until the mention of food made his stomach growl audibly. The hike had depleted his energy, and the cool mountain air sharpened his appetite. As the sky darkened to deep blue, the fraternity brothers gathered around the fire, paper bowls of steaming chili in hand. Danny sat on a log between Mike and Carlos, the warmth of the fire welcome against the evening chill. The first stars appeared overhead, far brighter than those visible from campus. "Before we get too comfortable," Brett said, standing before the group, "we need to go over some ground rules. This is bear country, so all food and scented items, including toothpaste and deodorant, need to go in the bear bags when not in use." He pointed to a system of ropes strung between 2 tall trees at the edge of the clearing, designed to hoist food containers well above the ground and out of reach of curious bears. "No wandering off alone, especially after dark," Brett continued. "If you need to take a leak in the night, wake up your tent mate to go with you. And for God's sake, no food in the tents. That's basically sending bears an engraved dinner invitation." Tyler stepped forward. "I've printed out information cards on what to do if you encounter a bear." He began passing out small laminated cards. "The black bears in this region are usually shy and avoid humans, but it's mating season, and they're more active than usual. If you see one, stay calm, speak in a normal voice to identify yourself as human. Back away, slowly, and make yourself look bigger." Danny studied the card intently. The bulleted list seemed woefully inadequate for a potential encounter with a 300-pound wild animal. One line in particular stood out: "If a black bear attacks, fight back with anything available. Rocks, sticks, fists. Do not play dead." "Playing dead only works with grizzlies," Tyler explained, seeming to read Danny's thoughts. "But we don't have grizzlies in Pennsylvania. Just American black bears. They're opportunistic, not predatory. Usually." "Usually?" Danny couldn't help but ask. Several brothers laughed, and Jason made a mock, growling sound. "Don't worry, O'Connor. Bears prefer their meat with some fat on it. You're nothing but bones." More laughter, and Danny forced himself to join in, though the joke at his expense stung. He'd always been self-conscious about his slender build, especially surrounded by guys like Brett and Jason, who spent hours at the campus gym. As the evening progressed, someone produced a bottle of whiskey, passing it around the circle. When it reached Danny, he took a small sip, the liquor burning a path down his throat. He wasn't much of a drinker, another area where he differed from many of his brothers, but tonight he welcomed the warmth it spread through his chest. Stories began to flow as freely as the alcohol. Tales of previous camping trips, mishaps and adventures, legends about the forest. Tyler, his voice low and dramatic in the firelight, told a story about a hiker who had gone missing in Allegheny 5 years ago. They found his pack 3 days, later torn to shreds, Tyler said, his face ghostly in the flickering light. But they never found him. Some say it was a bear, others say something worse lives in these woods. Like what? Someone asked. Tyler grinned. Like something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human anymore. A chorus of protests and nervous laughter followed. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He knew Tyler was just trying to scare them, a traditional part of camping trips. But in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, the forest suddenly seemed full of watching eyes. "All right, enough ghost stories," Brett interrupted. "We've got an early start tomorrow. Hiking to Kinzua Creek for fishing, then back here for the steak dinner. Anyone not in their tent by midnight gets breakfast duty." Gradually, the circle around the fire began to disperse. Danny helped Mike and Carlos clean up the dinner remains, carefully storing all food items in the bear bags before hoisting them high into the trees. By the time they crawled into their tent, Danny was exhausted, his muscles aching from the day's exertion. Despite his fatigue, sleep proved elusive. The ground was hard beneath his sleeping bag, and unfamiliar forest sounds penetrated the thin, nylon walls of the tent. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the creak and groan of trees in the gentle night breeze. Every sound made him tense, imagining dark shapes prowling just beyond their campsite. Carlos fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep and regular. Mike lasted longer, but eventually succumbed as well. Danny lay awake, listening to his tent mates' breathing and the symphony of the forest night. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were troubled, filled with shadows moving between trees and the sensation of being watched. He awoke to early morning light filtering through, the tent walls and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, panic gripped him. Then memory flooded back. The camping trip, Allegheny Forest, his fraternity brothers. Danny checked his watch, 6:30 a.m. He'd managed to sleep eventually, though he felt far from rested. Mike and Carlos were already gone from the tent. Danny pulled on jeans and a hoodie against the morning chill and emerged to find the campsite bustling with activity. Brett and Tyler were cooking breakfast on camp stoves, the smell of bacon making Danny's stomach rumble. Others were filling water bottles at the stream, which Tyler had assured them was safe to drink after treatment with purification tablets. "Morning, Sleeping Beauty," Jason called out as Danny made his way to the fire pit. "Thought we'd have to send a search party." Danny ignored the jibe, accepting a mug of coffee from Brett with a grateful nod. The hot liquid helped clear the fog from his brain, and by the time he'd consumed a plate of pancakes and bacon, he felt almost human again. "Today's agenda," Brett announced as the group finished breakfast. "We hiked to Kinzua Creek, about 3 miles east. The fishing's supposed to be excellent. Brook trout practically jumping into your hands. We'll have lunch there, then head back for the steak feast tonight." The prospect of a 6-mile round-trip hike after yesterday's trek made Danny's legs ache preemptively, but he kept his expression neutral, determined not to be the one complaining. As they cleaned up breakfast and prepared day packs, Danny felt a tap on his shoulder. "How'd you sleep?" Mike asked. "Not great," Danny admitted. "Every sound had me convinced a bear was about to rip through the tent." Mike laughed. "Yeah, first. Night in the woods is always like that. You'll sleep better tonight, trust me. Your body will be too exhausted to care about strange noises." An hour later, they were back on the trail, this time carrying only day packs with water, lunch, and fishing gear. Danny found the going easier without the heavy camping equipment, and the morning was pleasantly cool, the forest coming alive with birdsong and the chatter of squirrels. The trail to Kinzua Creek wound through valleys and over gentle hills, occasionally offering breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. Spring was in full force. Wildflowers dotted the forest floor, and the trees were dressed in the bright green of new leaves. Despite his initial reservations, Danny found himself enjoying the hike, even participating in the casual conversation that flowed among the group. They reached the creek shortly before noon. It was wider than Danny had expected, perhaps 20 feet across, with clear water flowing over a bed of smooth stones. The banks were grassy in spots, rocky in others, with several fallen logs providing natural seating. "This is perfect," Brett declared. "Let's set up here." Tyler distributed fishing gear, collapsible rods and small tackle boxes with an assortment of lures and hooks. Danny had never been fishing before and watched carefully as Mike demonstrated how to attach a lure and cast the line. "The key is a smooth motion," Mike explained, flicking his wrist to send the line arcing over the water. "Too much force and you'll just tangle it." Danny's first few attempts were clumsy, his line catching in branches overhead, or landing with an unceremonious plop just a few feet from shore. But Mike was patient, and eventually, Danny managed a respectable cast, his lure landing in a promising spot near a submerged log. "Now we wait," Mike said, settling onto a rock beside Danny. "Fishing is mostly patience." The next couple of hours passed pleasantly. The fraternity brothers spread out along the creek bank, some fishing seriously, others more interested in soaking up the spring sunshine or skipping stones across the Xi water's surface. To Danny's surprise, he actually caught a small brook trout, its scales flashing silver and blue in the sunlight as he reeled it in. "Not bad, O'Connor," Tyler called out, genuinely impressed. "That's dinner material right there." The praise, so rare from his fraternity brothers, warmed Danny more than the spring sun. With Tyler's help, he learned how to clean the fish, though he found the process somewhat gruesome. Several others caught fish as well, and by early afternoon they had a respectable catch to supplement their evening meal. They broke for lunch, sandwiches and trail mix, seated on rocks along the creek bank. The mood was relaxed, the competitive tension that often characterized fraternity interactions temporarily suspended in the tranquility of the setting. Even Jason seemed less inclined to target Danny with his usual mockery. As they packed up to head back to camp, Danny felt a contentment he hadn't expected. Maybe there was something to this outdoor life after all. The forest no longer seemed quite so alien and threatening in the daylight, and he'd proven to himself, and perhaps to others, that he could handle new challenges. The hike back was more strenuous, their path now mostly uphill. The afternoon had grown warmer, and Danny found himself stopping frequently to drink from his water bottle. By the time the campsite came into view, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his legs trembled with fatigue. "Free time until dinner," Brett announced as they arrived back at camp. "Steaks go on at 6. Anyone who wants to help with food prep." "See, Tyler." Danny volunteered to help, partly because he genuinely wanted to contribute, and partly because he didn't know what else to do with free time in the woods. While Tyler organized the meal preparation, others dispersed to various activities, some napping in tents, others playing cards or exploring the immediate vicinity of the campsite. As the afternoon waned, Danny found himself drawn to the small stream that bordered their clearing. Kneeling by the water, he splashed his face, the cold shocking but refreshing against his skin. He was about to return to camp when something caught his eye, a print in the soft mud of the bank. It was a paw print, much larger than a dog's, with 5 distinct toe pads and no visible claw marks. Danny's pulse quickened as he recalled the information from Tyler's bear safety card. Black bear prints typically showed 5 toes and could be distinguished from cougar prints by their more circular shape. This was definitely a bear print, and a fresh one at that. Danny straightened, scanning the trees around him with new awareness. The bear that left this print had been here recently, perhaps even watching their campsite. He should tell the others, especially Tyler and Brett. They'd want to know a bear was in the vicinity. Back at camp, he found Tyler arranging coals in the fire pit for the steaks. "Hey, Tyler," Danny said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I just found what I think is a bear print down by the stream. Looks pretty fresh." Tyler looked up, his expression shifting to alert interest. "Show me." Danny led him back to the stream and pointed out the print, now joined by Brett and a few others who had overheard the conversation. Tyler crouched to examine it. "Black bear for sure. Good-sized one too, probably male." He looked up at Brett. "We should do another safety briefing before dinner. Make sure everyone's being careful with food." Brett nodded, his usual brashness tempered by genuine concern. "Good catch, O'Connor. Everyone needs to be extra vigilant tonight." The discovery of the bear print cast a subtle shadow over the evening's preparations. Tyler reinforced the food storage protocols, and Brett assigned pairs for nighttime bathroom trips. The steaks, when they finally came off the grill, were delicious, perfectly cooked and flavored with simple salt and pepper. Danny's trout and those caught by others were also grilled, providing an impressive feast. As darkness fell and the fire blazed higher, the initial tension from the bear print discovery gradually dissipated. The whiskey bottles reappeared, and the mood grew jovial. Someone produced a guitar, and soon campfire songs, some traditional, others decidedly not, filled the night air. Danny sipped his whiskey slowly, enjoying the pleasant buzz that softened the edges of his awareness. He found himself laughing at jokes, joining in songs, feeling for perhaps the first time a genuine sense of brotherhood with these young men who had once seemed so intimidating. It was approaching midnight when nature called. Danny had been putting it off, reluctant to leave the warmth and safety of the fire circle, but finally he could delay no longer. Remembering the buddy system, he turned to Mike, who was deep in conversation with Carlos. "Hey, I need to, Danny gestured vaguely toward the trees. Mike nodded. "Give me a sec." But before Mike could extricate himself from his conversation, Jason intercepted. "I was just headed that way, O'Connor. Let's go." Danny hesitated. Jason was the last person he'd choose for a bathroom buddy given their history, but refusing would only invite mockery, and his need was becoming urgent. "Sure," he agreed, standing up. They grabbed flashlights and headed toward the designated bathroom area, a spot about 50 yards from camp where a fallen log provided some privacy. Jason walking slightly ahead, the beam of his flashlight bouncing through the darkness. "So discovering that bear print made you quite the hero," Jason remarked as they walked. "Brett actually remembered your name." Danny could hear the edge in Jason's voice. "Just happened to notice it, that's all." Jason's tone suggested disbelief. "You know, between that and catching a fish, people might think you're not completely useless in the outdoors." Danny remained silent, unwilling to engage. They reached the fallen log, and Jason stepped behind it first, while Danny waited, scanning the darkness nervously with his flashlight. The forest seemed especially alive at night, full of rustling movements and unidentifiable sounds. When Jason finished, they switched places. Danny was acutely aware of how vulnerable he was and hurried to complete his business. As he was about to rejoin Jason, a sharp crack like a branch breaking sounded from the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Both froze, listening intently. "What was that?" Danny whispered. "Probably just a raccoon," Jason said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Come on, let's get back." They turned to head back to camp, walking faster now. Another crack sounded, closer this time, followed by a rustling. In the underbrush to their right, Jason's flashlight swung wildly in that direction, illuminating nothing but dense foliage. "Move!" Jason hissed, breaking into a jog. Danny matched his pace, heart hammering against his ribs. The camp seemed impossibly far away, the glow of the fire barely visible through the trees. Behind them, the rustling grew louder, accompanied by a sound that made Danny's blood run cold, a deep, huffing grunt. "Bear!" Jason's voice was tight, with fear. "Don't run, remember? We're not supposed to run." They slowed to a walk, but every instinct in Danny's body screamed at him to flee. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a dark shape moving through the trees, larger than he had imagined a black bear would be. "Hey, bear!" Jason called out, his voice cracking slightly. "We're just humans, no need to—" "Be interested in us." The shape paused, and for a moment, Danny thought the standard advice might actually work. Then the bear huffed again and continued toward them, moving with surprising speed for its size. "Screw this," Jason muttered. Then shouted back toward camp, "Bear, bear coming in!" He broke into a run and Danny followed instantly, all thoughts of proper bear protocol forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. They crashed through undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, the sound of the bear's movement grew louder, crashing brush, heavy breathing. The fire was visible now, and shouts of alarm rose from the camp as the brothers realized what was happening. Danny could see figures standing, flashlights swinging in their direction, just a little further. His foot caught on a root and he went down hard, flashlight flying from his grip as he threw out his hands to break his fall. Pain shot through his right wrist, but fear propelled him back to his feet in an instant. Jason was already several yards ahead, not looking back. "Wait," Danny gasped, but the word was lost in his labored breathing. He ran again, aware that he'd lost precious seconds in the fall. The bear was closer now. He could hear its heavy breathing, smell its wild, musky scent. The camp was just 30 yards away, 20. Something heavy struck him from behind, and Danny found himself airborne for a terrifying moment before crashing to the ground again. This time the impact drove the breath from his lungs. He rolled onto his back, a reflexive motion that saved his life. Instead of exposing his neck and spine to the bear, he faced the animal as it loomed over him. In the dim light from the distant campfire, the bear seemed impossibly huge, its black fur absorbing what little illumination there was, its eyes reflecting a dull orange glow. It was a male black bear, as Tyler had surmised from the print, probably weighing over 300 pounds. Time seemed to slow as Danny stared up at the bear. He could hear shouting from the camp, saw flashlight beams bouncing toward him, but they seemed distant, disconnected from the immediate reality of the massive animal standing over him, head lowered, to inspect this strange creature that had invaded its territory. "Fight back!" The memory of Tyler's instructions sliced through Danny's paralysis. "Black bears, fight back!" With a desperate yell, Danny kicked upward, his hiking boot connecting solidly with the bear's muzzle. The animal jerked back, more surprised than hurt, then responded with a swipe of its massive paw. Danny rolled sideways, feeling the rush of air as the claws narrowly missed his face. He scrambled backward on all fours, still facing the bear, searching frantically for something, anything, to use as a weapon. His hand closed around a fallen branch, not much thicker than his wrist, but better than nothing. When the bear advanced again, Danny swung the branch, connecting with the animal's shoulder. The impact jarred the branch from his grip, and Danny knew he had only moments before. The bear was on him again. In that instant, he spotted a large pine tree a few yards away, its lower branches within reach. Without conscious thought, he launched himself toward it, driven by pure survival instinct. He reached the tree just as the bear recovered, his hands grasping the lowest branch and pulling with every ounce of strength he possessed. His feet scrabbled against the rough bark, finding purchase just as the bear swiped at his dangling legs. Danny felt a burning sensation across his left calf, but continued climbing, moving from branch to branch with an agility born of terror. 10 feet up, then 15. He finally paused, gasping for breath, his hands raw from the rough bark. The bear stood at the base of the tree, looking up at him with what Danny could have sworn was frustration. It reared up on its hind legs, reaching toward him with outstretched claws, but the lowest branch Danny had used was now well beyond its reach. From this vantage point, Danny could see his fraternity brothers gathered at the edge of camp, their flashlights trained on the scene. Tyler and Brett appeared to be organizing some kind of response, but no one ventured closer to the tree, where Danny clung like a terrified squirrel. "Stay there, Danny," Tyler's voice carried across the distance. "We're calling for help." The bear dropped back to all fours and circled the tree, occasionally standing to test its reach again. Danny watched its movements, trembling with adrenaline and fear, his mind racing through scenarios, none of them good. How long would the bear remain interested? How long could he stay in this tree? Would help arrive in time? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The bear eventually settled at the base of the tree, seemingly content to wait out its treed prey. Danny's muscles began to cramp from maintaining his position, and the initial surge of adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him acutely aware of the burning pain in his calf, where the bear's claws had caught him. From camp, he could hear his fraternity brothers discussing options in loud voices, probably hoping to scare the bear away with the noise. Someone mentioned banging pots together. Another suggested using the emergency air horn Tyler had packed, but no one seemed willing to approach close enough to actually implement these ideas. "Danny!" It was Mike's voice now. "Are you okay?" "Still alive," Danny called back, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "But I can't stay up here forever." As if in response to his words, the branch beneath Danny's right foot creaked ominously. He shifted his weight quickly, finding a more secure position, but the movement sent waves of pain through his injured calf. Blood was soaking through his jeans now, warm and sticky against his skin. The bear, sensing the movement above, stood again, reaching upward with renewed interest. Its claws scrabbled against the trunk, leaving deep gouges in the bark. Danny climbed higher, wincing as his injured leg protested the movement. From his new position, he could see more clearly what was happening in camp. Brett was on a satellite phone, the only reliable communication in this remote area, presumably calling for ranger assistance. Others were gathering whatever might serve as weapons, hiking poles, cooking implements, even tent stakes. But the bear, all 300+ pounds of wild unpredictability, remained between them and Danny. Time passed with excruciating slowness. The night air grew colder, and Danny found himself shivering, as much from shock as from the temperature. His hands, clenched around branches for so long, began to cramp and grow numb. Staying in the tree was becoming as dangerous as the bear below. Then, unexpectedly, the bear seemed to lose interest. It circled the tree one more time, sniffing the air, then ambled a few yards away to investigate something on the ground. Probably Danny's dropped flashlight. This was his chance. Looking toward the camp, Danny could see his brothers watching intently. He needed to make a decision. The rangers could be hours away, and he couldn't maintain his position much longer. The bear was distracted. The camp was close, and he had a clear path if he moved quickly. Taking a deep breath, Danny began to descend, moving as quietly as possible from branch to branch. When he reached the lowest branch, about 8 feet from the ground, he paused again, assessing the situation. The bear was still focused on the flashlight, poring at it curiously about 20 yards away. It was now or never. Danny let go of the branch and dropped to the ground, intending to land in a crouch and immediately sprint for camp. But his injured leg buckled as he landed, and a sharp pain exploded in his right shoulder as it absorbed the impact at an awkward angle. He felt something pop, a sensation of wrongness, and suddenly his arm hung useless at his side. The noise of his landing and his involuntary cry of pain immediately drew the bear's attention. It wheeled around, surprisingly quick for its size, and charged toward Danny with a speed that defied belief. Acting purely on instinct, Danny lunged toward camp, running awkwardly with his dislocated shoulder sending waves of agony through his body with every step. Behind him, he could hear the bear's heavy footfalls, its huffing breath. Ahead, his fraternity brothers were shouting, some advancing with their makeshift weapons, others retreating in fear. 20 yards to safety. 15. 10. The bear was gaining. Just as Danny reached the edge of the clearing, where the campfire's light spilled onto the forest floor, the bear made one final lunge. Danny felt a glancing blow across his back as he dove forward, landing hard on his injured shoulder. The pain was blinding, consuming his awareness for crucial seconds. When his vision cleared, Danny found himself surrounded by his brothers. Beyond their circle of bodies, the bear stood at the forest's edge, seemingly confused by the sudden gathering of humans, the bright fire, the cacophony of shouting voices. Several brothers were banging pots and pans together, creating a discordant clanging that hurt Danny's ears, but seemed to give the bear pause. For a long, tense moment, the standoff continued. 15 young men with improvised weapons facing a wild predator in its own territory. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and lumbered back into the darkness of the forest, disappearing among the trees like a shadow melting into night. A collective sigh of relief passed through the group, followed immediately by a flurry of activity. Tyler and Mike were at Danny's side checking his injuries. The pain in his shoulder was excruciating now, a hot, sharp agony that made it difficult to focus on anything else. Dislocated, Tyler pronounced after a careful examination. And these claw marks on your leg need cleaning right away. Brett, how long until the Rangers get here? Brett, still clutching the satellite phone, shook his head. They're sending someone, but it could be 3 hours. Storm system making helicopter evacuation impossible. We need to reduce this shoulder now then, Tyler said grimly. Danny, this is going to hurt like hell, but leaving it dislocated for hours could cause permanent damage. Danny nodded, unable to form words through the pain. Mike and Carlos positioned themselves on either side of him, providing support, as Tyler prepared to manipulate the joint back into place. On 3, Tyler said, grasping Danny's wrist and elbow in a specific grip. 1, 2, he moved before. Reaching 3, a common trick to prevent the patient from tensing up. There was a sickening moment of increased pain, then a distinct popping sensation as the humeral head slid back into the glenoid fossa of the shoulder joint. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, the sharp agony reducing to a dull, throbbing ache. "Thanks," Danny managed, his voice weak. "Don't thank me yet," Tyler replied, already turning his attention to the leg wounds. "These aren't deep, but in the wilderness, any wound can get infected quickly. This is going to sting." What followed was a painful process of wound cleaning using the first aid kit's antiseptic solution, followed by butterfly bandages to close the deeper scratches. By the time Tyler finished, Danny was pale and sweating, but the bleeding had stopped and both injuries had been stabilized as best as possible given their limited resources. Here, Jason appeared beside him, offering a metal cup filled with whiskey. Medicinal purposes. Danny accepted the cup with his good hand, surprised by the gesture from the fraternity brother who had abandoned him during the bear encounter. He took a long swallow, welcoming the burning sensation that momentarily distracted from his injuries. "I'm sorry I ran," Jason said quietly, his usual mockery absent. I panicked." "You're not alone," Danny replied after a moment. "I did too." Jason nodded, some unspoken understanding passing between them. Then he moved away, joining the others who were reinforcing the fire and establishing a watch rotation to ensure the bear didn't return. The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion for Danny. He sat propped against a log near the fire, his arm immobilized in a makeshift sling, his leg elevated on a folded sleeping bag. Mike stayed by his side, ensuring he remained hydrated and as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. The fraternity brothers took turns keeping watch, their usual boisterous behavior subdued by the night's events. Even Brett seemed humbled, his leadership temporarily wavering in the face of a situation beyond his control. It was nearly 4 in the morning when the Rangers finally arrived, 2 men and a woman, all wearing official Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources uniforms and carrying professional medical equipment. The female ranger, whose name tag identified her as Martinez, took charge of Danny's medical assessment, checking Tyler's first aid work with professional efficiency. "You did a good job with what you had," she told Tyler. The shoulder reduction was textbook. "You've had wilderness first aid training?" Tyler nodded. "Certified last summer. Never thought I'd actually need to use it." Ranger Martinez turned back to Danny. "You're lucky. The lacerations are superficial, and the shoulder, while painful, should heal completely with proper care. But we need to get you to a hospital for antibiotics, proper imaging, and formal treatment." The male rangers had been interviewing Brett and others about the encounter, documenting details of the bear's behavior and appearance. "Sounds like a young male, probably 3 to 4 years old," one of them commented. "This time of year, they're establishing territory and particularly aggressive about food sources. You were right to secure your provisions, but this animal may have had previous human contact that made it unusually bold." "Will you track it?" Brett asked. The ranger shook his head. "Black bears have large territories, sometimes up to 100 square miles. By now, it could be miles away. We'll file a report and post warnings at trailheads, but unless it shows a pattern of aggressive behavior toward humans, there's not much more we can do." This answer seemed to dissatisfy Brett, who had apparently expected a more dramatic response, perhaps a hunting party to track down the specific bear that had attacked a member of his fraternity. But the ranger's approach was pragmatic, recognizing that the humans were visitors in the bear's territory, not the other way around. With the first light of dawn breaking through the trees, the rangers prepared to evacuate. Danny. They had brought a specialized wheeled litter that could navigate the narrow forest trails, allowing them to transport him the 3 miles back to the nearest access road where an ambulance waited. As his fraternity brothers helped him onto the litter, Danny found himself the center of attention in a way he'd never experienced before. Brett clasped his good hand firmly. "Hell of a first camping trip, O'Connor. You handled yourself well out there." Others offered similar comments, expressions of respect mingled with relief that the situation hadn't ended more tragically. Even Jason approached, looking uncharacteristically humble. "That was some quick thinking climbing that tree," he said. "I should have stayed with you." Danny didn't quite know how to respond to this new dynamic. After months of trying to prove himself worthy of inclusion, he had inadvertently done so by surviving a bear attack. It seemed absurdly backwards. "We'll get your stuff back to campus," Mike promised as the Rangers prepared to depart, "and I'll check on you at the hospital later today." Danny nodded gratefully, too exhausted for many words. As the Rangers began, wheeling him away from camp, he caught a last glimpse of the clearing that had been their temporary home. The tents, the smoldering fire, his fraternity brothers watching his departure. It all seemed surreal now, like a dream rapidly fading in the light of morning. The journey back to the access road was slow and jarring, each bump in the trail sending spikes of pain through Danny's injured shoulder. The Rangers maintained a steady pace, one leading the way, checking for hazards while the other two managed the litter. They kept up a stream of reassuring conversation, asking Danny questions about his major, his hometown, clearly trying to keep him engaged and distracted from the pain. By the time they reached the ambulance, Danny was feverish and nauseated, his body responding to the trauma with delayed shock. The paramedics transferred him from the litter to a gurney, started an IV to address dehydration, and began a more thorough assessment of his injuries. The ambulance ride to Warren General Hospital took nearly an hour, winding through the rural roads of northwestern Pennsylvania. Danny drifted in and out of awareness, the pain medication administered by the paramedics creating a disconnected sensation as if he were observing his own experience from a distance. At the hospital, events moved quickly. X-rays confirmed Tyler's field diagnosis of a dislocated shoulder, showing no fractures, but significant soft tissue damage that would require physical therapy. The claw wounds on his calf and the more superficial scratches on his back were thoroughly cleaned, properly sutured where necessary, and dressed. Antibiotics were administered intravenously to prevent infection, and a tetanus booster was given as a precaution. By mid-afternoon, Danny found himself in a hospital room, his arm properly immobilized in a sling, his leg bandaged, various monitors tracking his vital signs. The immediate danger had passed, but the experience had left its mark, both physically and psychologically. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear charging toward him, felt the tree bark beneath his desperate fingers, experienced the sickening pop of his shoulder joint giving way. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A man in a khaki uniform stood in the doorway, not one of the Rangers who had rescued him, but clearly a park official of some kind. "Daniel O'Connor? I'm Deputy Warden Richards from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. If you're feeling up to I'd like to take your statement about the bear encounter." Danny nodded, and the warden pulled up a chair beside the bed, producing a digital recorder and a notepad. "Just tell me everything you remember from the beginning," Richards prompted. Danny recounted the events as clearly as he could: the camping trip, finding the bear print, the nighttime bathroom excursion with Jason, the chase, climbing the tree, the fall, and finally, the bear's departure. Richards listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly allowing Danny to tell the story at his own pace. "Based on your description and the reports from the Rangers, we're dealing with a subadult male black bear, probably around 3 years old," Richards said when Danny finished. "This is the time of year when they're establishing territory after leaving their mothers, and they can be especially assertive. Will you try to find it?" Danny asked, echoing Brett's earlier question to the Rangers. Richards shook his head. "Black bears rarely become habitual attackers of humans. This sounds like a situation where the bear was startled and responded defensively. Once you were in the tree, it was probably just curious rather than predatory. It didn't feel that way when it chased me back to camp," Danny said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from his voice. The warden's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I understand this was traumatic, but from a wildlife management perspective, this bear hasn't done anything that warrants intervention. It was in its natural habitat, encountered humans unexpectedly, and eventually departed without causing life-threatening injury." Danny wanted to argue, but found he lacked the energy. From a pure logic standpoint, he understood the warden's position. The bear was just being a bear, acting on instinct in its own territory. But logic felt cold comfort against the memory of those teeth, those claws, the primal fear he'd experienced. "I'll file a complete report," Richards continued, "and we'll post warnings at trailheads about increased bear activity in that area. But unless there's a pattern of aggressive encounters, that's the extent of our response." He paused, then added more gently, "You did well, you know. Climbing that tree probably saved your life." After the warden left, Danny was visited by a hospital psychologist who spoke with him briefly about potential emotional responses to the trauma he'd experienced. She explained that nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance were normal reactions and provided resources for follow-up care if needed. By evening, Mike and Carlos arrived, bringing Danny's phone and a change of clothes from his dorm room. The rest of his camping gear, they explained, would be brought back to campus the following day when the remainder of the fraternity returned. "The whole campus is talking about it already," Carlos said, settling into a visitor's chair. "Word got out that a UPW student was attacked by a bear. You're famous, man." Danny groaned. "Great, just what I wanted." "Brett's already planning to make it part of the Sam legend," Mike added. "The freshman who stared down a bear and lived to tell the tale." "That's not exactly how I remember it," Danny said wryly. "There was a lot more running and panicking in my version." They stayed for about an hour, bringing Danny up to speed on the aftermath at the campsite. The bear hadn't returned, but no one had slept much, and Brett had decided to cut the trip short by a day. They were breaking camp in the morning and heading back to campus. "Jason's been weirdly quiet," Carlos noted. "I think he feels guilty about leaving you behind." "He should," Mike said darkly. Danny shrugged his good shoulder. "Anyone would. Have run. I did too once I got the chance." After Mike and Carlos left, promising to visit again the next day, Danny was left alone with his thoughts and the muted sounds of the hospital at night. His parents had been notified and were driving from Philadelphia, expected to arrive by morning. They had been predictably horrified, his mother especially vocal about her objections to wilderness activities and fraternity outings in general. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nurses checking his vital signs and administering medication, but also by his own recurring nightmares. Dreams where the bear caught him before he reached the tree, where the branch broke beneath his weight, where his fraternity brothers watched impassively as the animal tore him apart. Morning brought his parents, his mother's face tight with worry as she embraced him carefully, mindful of his injuries. His father, typically stoic, appeared shaken, clasping Danny's good hand firmly between both of his own. "We were so worried," his mother said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead in a gesture familiar from childhood illnesses. "When we got that call, I'm okay, Mom," Danny assured her, though the words felt hollow against the evidence of his bandaged body. "This fraternity," his father began, a note of anger entering his voice. "What kind of supervision?" "It wasn't their fault, Dad," Danny interrupted. "It was just bad luck, wrong place, wrong time." His parents exchanged a look that suggested they didn't entirely accept this explanation, but were willing to table the discussion for now. They spent the morning with him, speaking with doctors, reviewing discharge instructions and arranging for Danny's return to Philadelphia for the remainder of his recovery. The spring semester was nearly over anyway, and arrangements could be made for him to complete final exams remotely. By afternoon, he was officially discharged, wheeled to his parents' waiting car by a hospital volunteer about its life, unaware of the impact it had had on his. At campus, they found Danny's dormitory buzzing with activity. News of the bear attack had spread widely, and Danny found himself the reluctant center of attention as he made his way to his room, his arm in a sling, his parents hovering protectively on either side. "Dude, you're the bear guy!" A student, Danny vaguely recognized from his introduction to economics class, accosted him in the hallway. "Is it true you fought it off with your bare hands?" Before Danny could correct this wildly inaccurate version of events, others joined in, peppering him with questions about the size of the bear, whether he'd been afraid, if he would be interviewed on the local news. The story had apparently grown with each retelling, transforming from a frightening but relatively brief encounter into an epic battle between man and beast. Escaping to his room, Danny found Mike waiting, helping to pack some essential items for Danny's stay in Philadelphia. "The brothers want to see you before you leave," Mike said as they worked. "They're gathering at the house in about an hour." Danny hesitated, torn between his desire to return to the safety of home and a strange reluctance to leave without some form of closure with his fraternity. In the end, it was his father who made the decision. "We can spare an hour," he said, surprising Danny with his understanding. "I'd like to meet these young men anyway." The Sigma Alpha Mu House was a stately brick building on Fraternity Row, its white columns and manicured lawn projecting an image of tradition and respectability. As Danny's father parked in the circular driveway, Danny felt an unexpected nervousness. The last time he'd seen most of his brothers had been in the chaotic aftermath of the bear attack. Now returning as something of a minor campus celebrity, he wasn't sure what to expect. Brett met them at the door, shaking hands with Danny's parents with formal politeness, before leading them to the common room where the entire fraternity had assembled. A cheer went up as Danny entered, startling him with its enthusiasm. "The man of the hour," Brett announced, clapping Danny carefully on his uninjured shoulder. "Our very own bear whisperer." Danny flushed with embarrassment. "Hardly. I just climbed a tree and survived a direct encounter with one of North America's apex predators," Tyler added. "Don't downplay it, Danny. Most people never face that kind of situation in their entire lives." What followed was a strangely formal ceremony. Brett presented Danny with a wooden plaque, clearly hastily purchased and engraved, commemorating his courage in the face of ursine adversity. The brothers had all signed it, their names crowding the edges of the wood in various handwritings. "We also took a vote," Brett continued, his expression uncharacteristically serious, "and the Brotherhood unanimously decided that you've more than fulfilled any remaining pledge obligations. You're a full member of Sigma Alpha Mu, with all rights and privileges thereof." Another cheer went up, and Danny found himself genuinely touched by the gesture, absurd as the circumstances were. His parents watched from the sidelines, his father's initial skepticism visibly softening at this display of solidarity. After the formal presentation, the gathering became more casual. Danny's brothers approached in small groups to check on him, share their perspectives on the events in the forest, and yes, occasionally make jokes at his expense. But the teasing had lost its previous edge of exclusion. He was now being ribbed as one of them, not as an outsider. Jason was the last to approach, hanging back until the crowd around Danny had thinned. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot before finally speaking. "So there's something I need to say," he began awkwardly. "I screwed up out there. I left you behind when the bear charged, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." The apology was unexpected, and for a moment, Danny didn't know how to respond. The Jason he'd known during his pledge semester would never have admitted fault, particularly not in front of others. "Like I said before, anyone would have run," Danny finally replied. "I would have too, if I'd been a few steps ahead of you." Jason shook his head. "No, man, you climbed that tree. You kept your head. I panicked completely." He extended his hand. "Anyway, I owe you one, for whatever that's worth." Danny accepted the handshake, feeling a strange sense of closure. He'd spent months trying to earn Jason's respect and the acceptance of the fraternity. It had never occurred to him that it would come through such an extreme circumstance. As they prepared to leave, Brett pulled Danny aside for a final word. "So, we're planning the fall camping trip already," he said with a grin. "Thought we might try the Poconos next time. Less bear activity there." The thought of another camping trip sent a cold shiver through Danny. The forest, which had briefly seemed beautiful and welcoming during that day of fishing, now represented danger in his mind. Dark spaces where predators waited, where human visitors were vulnerable and exposed. "I think I'll sit that one out," Danny replied, trying to keep his voice light. Brett's expression shifted to one of understanding. "Can't blame you for that, but the invitation stands, if you change your mind." He paused, then added, "You know, they say getting back on the horse is the best way to overcome a fall." Danny nodded non-committally, but internally he knew his camping days were over, at least for the foreseeable future. Some experiences couldn't be simply overcome by repetition. They left deeper marks. The drive to Philadelphia took nearly 6 hours, long stretches of highway punctuated by stops for food and medication. Danny slept for much of it, the combined effects of pain relief and emotional exhaustion pulling him into dreamless unconsciousness. When he woke, they were entering the familiar urban landscape of the city, concrete and steel replacing the forests of western Pennsylvania, traffic noise drowning out the memory of wind through trees. Home was a 3-story brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, unchanged since Danny had left for college the previous fall. His room waited exactly as he'd left it, his high school achievements displayed on walls and shelves, his single bed made up with fresh sheets in anticipation of his return. The next few days passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and rest. His parents hovered attentively, his mother preparing all his favorite foods, his father handling the administrative tasks of communicating with the university about his absence and arranging for remote completion of coursework. Friends from High school visited, eager to hear the story firsthand, their eyes widening at the more dramatic moments of his narrative. Meanwhile, on campus, the story continued to evolve. Mike sent regular updates via text, reporting that Danny was now something of a legend at UPW. Bear Grylls O'Connor had become his nickname, a play on the famous survival expert's name that was equal parts admiring and mocking. The Sigma Alpha. Moose Spring Formal had featured a hastily prepared slideshow of the camping trip, culminating in artistic renderings of Danny's tree-climbing escape. A local newspaper ran a small article about the incident, buried in the middle pages and consisting mostly of quotations from the Pennsylvania Game Commission about bear safety. The university's environmental science department used the encounter as a case study in their wildlife management course. But beyond these minor ripples, the bear attack remained what it was, a frightening but limited encounter between one human and one bear in a remote corner of a large forest. As the semester came to an end and his physical recovery progressed, Danny faced decisions about his return to campus in the fall. His parents, particularly his mother, argued for a transfer to a Philadelphia area school where he could live at home. The bear attack, in their view, was evidence that he wasn't ready for the independence of campus life, let alone the questionable influence of a fraternity. Danny resisted. Despite the trauma, or perhaps because of it, he felt a need to return to UPW, to reclaim the college experience on his own terms. The fraternity, surprisingly, had become a source of support rather than stress. Daily texts from brothers checking on his recovery, care packages sent to his home address, even video calls to help him prepare for final exams, all confirmed that he had found the belonging he'd originally sought, albeit through unexpected means. By midsummer, his shoulder had healed enough for him to discard the sling, though certain movements still caused discomfort. The claw marks on his calf had faded to pink lines, destined to become permanent scars, physical reminders of his encounter with the wild. The psychological wounds healed more slowly. Nightmares persisted, though with decreasing frequency. Unexpected sounds, a branch scraping against a window, a dog growling in the distance, could trigger momentary panic, his heart racing with the memory of fear. On a warm August evening, as Danny sat on the back patio of his family home, his father joined him with 2 bottles of beer, passing one to Danny in a rare acknowledgement of his son's approaching adulthood. "Your mother's worried about you going back," his father said after a long silence. Danny nodded, taking a sip of the beer. "I know. She thinks you'd be safer here." "Probably would be," Danny agreed, "but I need to go back." His father studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Because of what happened?" "Partly." Danny struggled to articulate the complex mixture of feelings. "I don't want that to be the thing that defines my college experience. Running away and transferring, it would make the bear the most important part of my story." His father seemed to consider this, turning his beer bottle slowly between his hands. When I was about your age, I was mugged. 2 guys with knives took my wallet, my watch, everything I had. Didn't physically hurt me beyond a few bruises, but I was terrified." Danny stared at his father, surprised. This was the first he'd heard of such an incident. "For weeks afterward, I wouldn't go out alone after dark," his father continued. "Jumped at every shadow, thought about transferring to a smaller college in a safer town." He paused. "But I didn't, and eventually, the fear faded. Not completely. I still take certain precautions, still stay aware of my surroundings, but it stopped controlling me. That's what I want," Danny said simply. "For it to stop controlling me." His father nodded. "Then you should go back. Just promise you'll stay out of the woods for a while." Danny smiled wryly. "Trust me, that won't be a problem." When Danny returned to campus that fall, he found his minor celebrity had mostly faded with the summer. New stories, new dramas had replaced his bear encounter in the collective consciousness of the student body. A few professors mentioned it during the first week of classes, and occasionally a freshman would approach him, having heard the tale from an upperclassman, but generally, life had moved on. The fraternity welcomed him back warmly, and Danny settled into his role as a sophomore with more confidence than he'd felt as a freshman. He moved into the fraternity house, sharing a room with Mike, and found that the social dynamics had shifted slightly in his favor. His ordeal had earned him a certain respect, and the teasing, when it came, was affectionate rather than exclusionary. True to his word, Danny avoided camping trips and forest excursions. When the fraternity organized their fall retreat to the Poconos, he volunteered to handle logistics from campus, arranging equipment rentals and food supplies without actually joining the expedition. His brothers understood, or seemed to, and no one pushed him to participate. Life developed a new rhythm. Classes, fraternity responsibilities, weekend activities that carefully avoided wilderness settings. Danny found himself drawn to urban explorations instead. Museums, concerts, restaurants in neighboring towns. He developed an appreciation for environments shaped by human hands, where nature was controlled and predictable. The nightmares diminished, with time, appearing only occasionally, often triggered by specific reminders. A nature documentary featuring bears, the sound of branches scraping against his window during a storm. The scars on his calf faded further, still visible but no longer angry and red against his skin. In November, nearly 7 months after the attack, Danny received an unexpected email from Deputy Warden Richards of the Pennsylvania Game Commission. The message was brief, informing him that a black bear matching the description of the one that had attacked him had been euthanized after multiple aggressive encounters with hikers in Allegheny National Forest. The email emphasized that such action was taken only as a last resort, when an animal demonstrated consistent dangerous behavior toward humans. Danny stared at the screen for a long time after reading the message. He had assumed the bear that attacked him had continued its existence somewhere in the vast forests of Pennsylvania, as unaware of the impact it had had on his life as he was of whatever happened in the animal's daily struggle for survival. The news of its death stirred complicated emotions, not satisfaction or vindication, as he might once have expected, but something more like sadness, a recognition of the arbitrary nature of their encounter and its consequences for both of them. He never mentioned the email to his fraternity brothers. Somehow it felt like a private epilogue to a story that had already been told too many times, embellished and distorted with each retelling until it barely resembled his actual experience. The truth, the fear, the pain, the lingering psychological impact remained his alone, much like the scars that only he saw each day. When spring came around again and plans began forming for another Sam camping trip, this time to the Catskills, in New York, Danny once again declined to participate. There were knowing looks, a few good-natured comments about Bear Grylls, preferring the comforts of civilization, but no real pressure to join. Jason, who had become, if not exactly a friend, then at least not an antagonist, caught up with Danny after the trip planning meeting. "You're really never going camping again, are you?" he asked, more curious than mocking. Danny shrugged. "Probably not with a large, noisy group of frat guys," he replied. "Maybe someday, with the right people, in the right circumstances, but not yet." Jason nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough, we'll keep your spot open just in case." He hesitated, then added, "You know, I still think about that night sometimes, what I should have done differently." "Don't," Danny said firmly. "It happened the way it happened. We both survived. That's what matters." As Jason walked away, Danny reflected on how much had changed in a year. He had come to college seeking reinvention, a new identity separate from his high school self. He had found it, though not in the way he'd expected or desired. The bear, that random wild force that had crossed his path for mere minutes in a vast forest, had played a larger role in shaping his college identity than any deliberate action on his part. Yet as he watched his fraternity brothers planning their trip, laughing and arguing over details, he realized that he had achieved what he'd originally sought. He belonged among them now, his place secure regardless of whether he joined their woodland adventures. The belonging had come at a cost, physical pain, lingering fear, scars both visible and invisible, but it was real nonetheless. Outside, spring was transforming the campus. Trees that had stood bare through the winter were budding with new leaves, their branches reaching toward the sun. Nature, contained and cultivated within the boundaries of the university grounds, no longer triggered the primal fear that forests now evoked. Danny could appreciate its beauty from a distance, respecting its power without surrendering to its call. Somewhere in the forests of Pennsylvania, in the place where their paths had crossed, the seasons were changing as well. The tree Danny had climbed continued its slow growth, perhaps still bearing the marks of his desperate ascent, perhaps not. The clearing where the fraternity had camped would be growing over with new vegetation. The fire pit cold and forgotten, the human presence faded like footprints after rain. The bear that had charged from the darkness was gone now, but others, like it, continued their ancient patterns. Foraging, mating, raising cubs, defending territory. The rhythm of wildlife proceeded according to laws older than human memory, indifferent to the brief intersections with human stories. Danny touched the scars on his calf absently, a gesture that had become habit over the past year. They were the only tangible evidence of his encounter, the only proof beyond his own memory that it had happened at all. To most who heard the story, it was just that, a story, an entertaining anecdote about a college freshman's misadventure in the woods, embellished with each retelling until the truth was obscured beneath layers of exaggeration. But Danny knew what had really happened in those terrifying moments when human civilization fell away, and he faced something ancient and powerful, something that viewed him not as a college student, a fraternity brother, a son, but simply as another animal. In the woods, potentially prey, potentially threat, but nothing more significant than that. That knowledge, the humbling, terrifying recognition of his place in the natural order, was perhaps the true scar, deeper and more lasting than the marks on his skin. It was an awareness he carried now in his daily life, an understanding that, beneath the structures of human society, the wild world continued to exist, operating by its own rules, occasionally intersecting with human lives in brief, consequential moments, before receding again into its own separate reality. As Danny turned back toward the fraternity house, leaving the spring day behind, he knew the bear would always walk with him in some sense, a shadow at the edge of consciousness, a reminder of vulnerability, mortality, and the thin veneer of safety that separated human existence from the older, wilder truths of the world. Not a lesson he had sought to learn, but one he would never forget, carried in his body and mind like the distant echo of footfalls in a darkened forest. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The morning air was crisp with autumn's promise as Clara Nguyen zipped her fleece jacket to her chin, already thinking about the alpine paintbrush specimens she hoped to catalogue before noon. At 42, Clara had spent nearly 2 decades as a botanist with the University of Wyoming, but fieldwork in Grand Teton National Park never lost its magic. Her weathered hiking boots crunched over the gravel path as she made her way from the research station's parking lot toward the meeting point where her small team would gather. "Morning, Dr. Nguyen," called Jason Peterson, a doctoral student, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and boundless enthusiasm for wildflower taxonomy. "Weather report says we've got clear skies until at least 4. Clara nodded, checking her watch. 6:47 a.m. right on schedule. "Perfect. We should be able to complete the full northwest quadrant survey." She adjusted her glasses and tucked a strand of black hair behind her ear, surveying the small group assembled before her. Besides Jason, there was Mackenzie Foster, a field technician in her late 20s with sun-freckled cheeks and a meticulous eye for detail, and Dr. Robert Harrington, a visiting ecologist from Colorado State who had joined their project just 3 weeks prior. All wore the practical earth tones and layered clothing that fieldwork demanded. "Today we're focusing on the subalpine meadow ecosystems," Clara explained, unfolding a topographical map across the hood of the university's White Ford expedition. "We'll take the trail up about 3 miles to Lupine Meadow, then split into pairs to maximize coverage." Her finger traced the route as she spoke. "Remember to document any instances of Castilleja linearifolia with the GPS markers. The changing bloom patterns could give us valuable data on the warming trends we've been tracking." The team nodded, checking equipment and adjusting backpacks. Clara had worked with most of them long enough that the morning briefing was almost ceremonial. They knew the protocols, understood the objectives. But ritual had its place in scientific fieldwork, where overlooking even small details could compromise months of research. "Any wildlife spotted yesterday?" Robert asked, his voice carrying a note of both excitement and apprehension. Though experienced in wilderness research, he was still relatively new to grizzly country. "Nothing unusual," Mackenzie replied, securing her water bottle to her backpack. "Some elk near the eastern boundary. A couple of black bears about half a mile from Taggart Lake, but they kept their distance." Clara nodded. "Standard protocol applies. Stay in visual contact with your partner, keep conversation audible, and remember that we're visitors in their territory." She didn't need to specify who they were. Everyone working in Grand Teton understood the unspoken respect and caution toward the park's apex predators. The team locked the equipment they wouldn't need in the vehicle and began their hike. Along the well-maintained trail, that would eventually lead them to their research area. Clara fell into step beside Robert, noting how his eyes continually scanned the surrounding forest. "First time in grizzly territory?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Robert nodded, adjusting his backpack straps. "That obvious?" "Huh? Everyone's cautious their first season," Clara said with a small smile. "I get used to it but never complacent. That's the key." "I've read all the protocols, watched all the training videos," Robert replied, "but it's different actually being here. Every rustling sound—" He trailed off, almost embarrassed. "Healthy respect is good," Clara assured him. "In 15 years of fieldwork in Wyoming and Montana, I've only had 3 distant grizzly sightings. They generally want nothing to do with us." The conversation faded as the trail steepened, their breath needed for the climb rather than chat. The forest around them was coming fully alive with morning sounds, chickadees calling from the lodgepole pines, the occasional distant bugle of an elk, the whisper of breeze through autumn-touched aspen leaves. September in the Tetons meant fewer tourists, cooler temperatures, and the beginning of the bears' hyperphagic period as they prepared for winter hibernation. That last fact lingered in Clara's mind as they hiked. Bears in hyperphagia could consume up to 20,000 calories per day, foraging constantly. While this typically meant they focused on berries, whitebark pine nuts, and other plant foods, it also meant they were more active and could be encountered almost anywhere in their territory. After almost an hour of steady hiking, they emerged into Lupine Meadow, a vast open expanse ringed by pine forest, with the iconic jagged peaks of the Teton Range forming a dramatic backdrop. In spring, the meadow was a riot of purple lupine and red paintbrush, but now in early autumn it was dominated by the golden hues of dying grasses and late-blooming goldenrod. "Let's set up the primary survey station here," Clara suggested, pointing to a relatively flat area near the meadow's eastern edge. "Jason and Mackenzie, you take the northern quadrants. Robert and I will cover the southern section. Meet back here at noon for lunch and data comparison." The team efficiently unpacked the survey equipment, quadrat frames for measuring vegetation density, soil sampling tools, cameras, GPS units, and specimen collection containers. Despite her many years of fieldwork, Clara still felt a flutter of excitement as she organized her equipment. The systematic documentation of flora might seem tedious to outsiders, but to her, it was a window into the subtle, intricate changes occurring in this ecosystem, changes that told a larger story about climate, adaptation, and survival. "Ready when you are," Robert said, his initial nervousness seeming to fade now that they were engaged in the familiar rituals. "Half-scientific observation." Clara nodded, slipping her notebook into her pocket and shouldering her pack. "Let's head south along the tree line first. I want to check on a particular paintbrush population I've been monitoring for 3 seasons." They walked at a measured pace, Clara occasionally stopping to photograph or note the location of significant plant communities. Robert proved to be an efficient partner, quickly learning her documentation system and offering insights from his own ecological perspective. The morning passed productively. By 11:30 a.m. they had covered about 2/3 of their assigned area, cataloging several notable shifts in plant community composition compared to the previous year's data. Clara was particularly interested in the increased presence of species typically found at lower elevations, further evidence of the warming trend she'd been documenting. "I need to make a quick stop," Clara said, gesturing toward a small cluster of portable toilets that the Park Service maintained near the popular hiking trails. Being September, past the peak tourist season, the facilities were less frequently used but still regularly serviced. "No problem," Robert replied. "I'll set up the next survey point about 50 meters south. That patch of late asters looks interesting." Clara nodded and headed toward the porta potties. The day had warmed considerably, and she unzipped her fleece as she walked. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals rising from the sun-warmed meadow. The beauty of this place never diminished, no matter how many times she visited. There was something about the Tetons, their abrupt rise from the valley floor without foothills, their jagged snow-capped peaks, that inspired awe even in the most scientifically minded observer. She reached the small cluster of 3 portable toilets, noting with relief that they appeared reasonably clean, not always a guarantee in remote park locations. Choosing the middle unit, she stepped inside, securing the plastic latch behind her. The momentary isolation gave Clara time to reflect on the morning's findings. The shifting bloom times and species distribution were consistent with her working hypothesis about microclimate changes in the subalpine zones. She was mentally composing sections of her next research paper when a sound from outside interrupted her thoughts. At first it was just a rustling, perhaps the wind or a small animal moving through the nearby brush. But then came a distinctive sound that sent an instinctive chill down her spine, the huffing breath of a large animal, followed by the snapping of branches under heavy weight. Clara froze, her hand halfway to the door latch. Years of wilderness training told her to stay calm, to think rationally, but the primitive part of her brain was already accelerating her heart rate, preparing her body for a threat her senses had identified before her conscious mind could process. Through the small ventilation gaps near the top of the porta potty, she could hear the animal moving closer. The huffing breath was unmistakable now. Not the soft snuffling of a black bear, but the deeper, more deliberate breathing of a grizzly. Clara had heard recordings during park safety trainings, had even heard the sound from a distance during one of her rare bear sightings, but never this close, never with only a thin plastic wall between her and the apex predator. She reached for her pack, a surge of panic rising when she realized she'd left it with Robert. No bear spray. The cardinal rule of Teton fieldwork, and she'd broken it in a moment of complacency. The sounds outside grew louder. Clara could hear the bear moving around the toilet cluster, investigating the unfamiliar objects in its territory. A heavy thud against the side of the structure sent a vibration through the plastic walls. Clara pressed herself against the opposite side, trying to control her breathing, knowing that excessive noise might increase the bear's curiosity. Through the ventilation slits, she caught a glimpse of tawny fur with the distinctive shoulder hump of a grizzly. It was an average-sized bear, perhaps 400 pounds, its coat thick in preparation for the coming winter. The bear rose onto its hind legs, a behavior Clara knew was not aggressive, but rather a way to better smell and observe its surroundings. At its full height, the bear's head was level with the top of the porta potty. Clara could hear its breath, smell the musky, wild scent of it. The bear dropped down to all fours and circled the structure again, its powerful shoulders brushing against the plastic with enough force to rock the unit slightly. Clara's mind raced through her training. Make noise to avoid surprising bears. Travel in groups. Carry bear spray. None of these standard protocols helped in her current situation. She was alone, confined, and unarmed. The bear moved to the door of the unit, pressing against it with enough force that the plastic bent inward slightly. The flimsy latch creaked under the pressure. Clara stared at it, calculating how long it might hold against the bear's strength if the animal became determined to investigate further. Then came the sound she had been dreading, the scrape of claws against plastic as the bear batted at the door. The entire structure shuddered. Another blow followed, and Clara heard the distinct sound of plastic cracking. Looking down, she saw the door bowing inward, a small fracture forming near the latch. Time seemed to slow. Clara pressed herself against the back wall of the porta potty, making herself as small as possible. Her scientific mind, the part that remained oddly detached even in crisis, noted the bear's behavior. Not predatory aggression, just curiosity. The grizzly was investigating an unusual object in its environment, perhaps attracted by the unfamiliar human sense. Another blow to the door sent a larger crack spreading across the plastic. The latch was barely holding. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized the next impact might break through completely. But instead of another blow, there was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of the bear dropping down to all fours. Clara could hear it snuffling along the ground, moving away from the door toward the side of the unit. After a moment, its interest apparently diverted, the bear moved further away. Clara remained frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes passed. The sounds of the bear faded until she could no longer hear them. Still, she didn't move, acutely aware of how quickly the animal could return if something caught its attention. Another 5 minutes passed in silence. Finally, Clara allowed herself to take a deeper breath. Her legs were shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. Carefully, she moved toward the damaged door, pressing her ear against it and listening intently. No huffing breath, no heavy footfalls, just the normal sounds of the meadow. Wind through grass, distant bird calls. With trembling fingers, she gently tested the latch. It held, though just barely. Through the door's small window, she scanned what limited view she had of the surrounding area. No sign of the bear. She needed to leave the porta potty, staying. Inside indefinitely wasn't an option, but the thought of emerging only to find the grizzly nearby was terrifying. Where was Robert? He should be relatively close, setting up their survey point. Clara considered calling out to him, but hesitated. If the bear was still in the vicinity, yelling might draw its attention back to her. She decided to wait a few more minutes, continuing to listen and watch through the small window. When she remained convinced the bear had moved on, she carefully unfastened the damaged latch and opened the door a few inches, peeking out. The meadow stretched before her, peaceful in the midday sun. She scanned the tree line, the nearby brush, searching for any sign of the bear. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open further and stepped out, immediately looking in all directions. The bear was gone, but it had left clear evidence of its visit. Deep scratches marked the blue plastic door, and one corner was deeply dented, where the grizzly had struck it with particular force. Clara didn't linger. Moving as quickly and quietly as possible, she headed in the direction where Robert should be working. Her legs still felt unsteady, and her heart continued to race, but the immediate danger appeared to have passed. "Robert," she called softly when she neared the area where they'd been working. "Robert?" He appeared from behind a cluster of sagebrush, clipboard in hand. "Hey, I was just about to come looking for you. I found a fascinating example of—" He stopped mid-sentence, noticing her expression. "What happened? Are you all right?" "Grizzly," Clara said, the word coming out breathier than she intended. "By the porta potties. I was inside when it came. It's gone now, I think. But we need to gather our things and alert the others." Robert's eyes widened. "Are you sure it's gone? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Clara assured him, though her voice betrayed her lingering fear. "It didn't break in, just investigated. Damaged. The door pretty badly." She glanced at her backpack lying near their equipment. "I need my bear spray, then we should find Jason and Mackenzie immediately." Robert handed her the backpack, and Clara quickly located the canister of bear spray, securing it to her belt where it should have been all along. The weight of it against her hip provided a small measure of reassurance. "Let's pack up quickly," she instructed. "Minimum noise, maximum efficiency. I want to alert the others and get back to a more trafficked area." They gathered their equipment in silence, constantly scanning their surroundings. Clara tried to focus on the practical tasks, but her mind kept replaying those moments in the porta potty, the sound of the bear's breath, the crack of plastic under its powerful paws, the certainty that only chance had prevented a direct encounter. Once they had packed their essential equipment, leaving the heavier survey tools to retrieve later. They headed north to find Jason and Mackenzie. Clara set a brisk pace, her hand never straying far from the bear spray canister. "There they are," Robert said after about 10 minutes of walking, pointing toward the northern edge of the meadow where their colleagues were visible, bent over. "Their survey equipment." Clara raised her arm and waved to catch their attention, still not wanting to call out loudly. Jason noticed first, straightening up and waving back. He nudged Mackenzie and both started walking toward Clara and Robert. "What's up?" Jason asked as they approached, immediately sensing something was wrong. "You two look like you've seen a ghost." "Grizzly," Clara explained for the second time, the word no less potent. "Near the porta potties. I was inside when it investigated. Damaged the door, but moved on without getting in." Mackenzie's eyes widened. "Are you okay?" "Shaken but unharmed," Clara replied. "But we need to report this immediately and head back to the trailhead. The bear wasn't showing predatory behavior, but it was definitely comfortable approaching. Human structures, which is concerning." Jason was already pulling out his radio. As a precaution for their remote fieldwork, the team carried park service radios that connected them to ranger stations in emergencies. He switched to the emergency channel. "This is Field Research Team Nguyen, reporting a grizzly bear encounter near Lupine Meadow porta potties. No injuries, but requesting ranger assistance and alerting any hikers in the area. Over." The radio crackled and a ranger's voice responded. "Copy that, research team. Can you provide details on the bear's size, behavior, and current location?" "Over." Clara took the radio. "This is Dr. Nguyen. Adult grizzly, approximately 400 pounds, brown coat. Last seen approximately 20 minutes ago, moving east from the Lupine Meadow facilities. The bear investigated and damaged a porta potty while I was inside, but moved on, without aggressive behavior. Classification would be curious rather than predatory, but it showed no fear of human structures." "Over." Copy that, Dr. Nyan, the ranger replied. Please proceed cautiously to the Lupine Meadow trailhead. We'll send rangers to your location to escort you if needed and to track the bear. Are you carrying bear spray? Over. Affirmative. All. Team members have spray and are traveling as a group. We'll head directly to the trailhead. Over. Understood. Maintain radio contact and report immediately if you sight the bear again. Ranger team will meet you at the trailhead. Out. Clara handed the radio back to Jason. Let's move. Stay tight. Keep alert. The team arranged themselves in a close formation, everyone scanning different directions as they walked. No one spoke much beyond necessary communications. The encounter had cast a pall over what had been a routine research day, reminding them all of the wild nature of their workplace. The 3-mile hike back to the trailhead felt much longer than the morning's journey. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant sound brought a moment of tension. Clara walked at the front of the group, constantly scanning the trail ahead and the surrounding forest. The weight of responsibility for her team's safety pressed heavily on her, made more acute by her earlier carelessness in leaving her bear spray behind. About halfway back to the trailhead, they encountered 2 rangers hiking up to meet them, both carrying rifles in addition to their standard equipment. Dr. Nguyen, one called as they approached. Clara nodded. That's me. I'm Ranger Collins. This is Ranger Dawson. We'll escort you back to the trailhead. Another team is headed to the porta potties to assess the damage and look for the bear. Thank you, Clara said, relief evident in her voice. As they continued down the trail with the rangers, Clara provided a more detailed account of her encounter. The rangers listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the bear's behavior and appearance. Sounds like a bear we've been monitoring, Ranger Collins said when she finished. 3-year-old male, been ranging widely this season. No previous negative human interactions, but he's been spotted near developed areas more frequently than we'd like. Will he be relocated? Mackenzie asked. The ranger shook his head. Not for this. We'll increase patrols in the area and monitor his movements more closely. We only relocate if there's predatory behavior or repeated problematic interactions. This sounds like normal investigative behavior, though the lack of fear of human structures is something we'll watch. They reached the trailhead around 2:30 p.m., where several more Park Service vehicles were parked. A small crowd of hikers had gathered, kept at a distance by another ranger who was explaining the situation. Clara and her team were led to one of the ranger vehicles, where they were asked to provide formal statements for the incident report. The process was thorough but efficient. The Park Service had well-established protocols for wildlife encounters. We'll need you to identify the damaged facility and show us exactly where this occurred, a senior ranger named Martinez explained. But not today. We'll escort you back tomorrow if you're comfortable with that. Clara nodded, though the thought of returning to the scene so soon sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. Of course, whatever helps. After completing their statements, Clara gathered her team near their university vehicle. I think we should head back to the research station, she said. We can assess our collected data and determine how to proceed with the survey. No one objected. The enthusiasm of the morning had been replaced by a subdued awareness of their vulnerability in this beautiful but wild place. The drive back to the University of Wyoming's research station was mostly silent. Clara's mind kept returning to those moments in the porta potty, the sounds, the smells, the visceral fear. She had always respected the wilderness and its dangers, had always followed protocols, except for that one crucial lapse today. The thought of what might have happened if the bear had been more determined, if the plastic door had given way completely, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. At the research station, a modest facility with laboratories, dormitory-style accommodations, and a common area, Clara called an immediate team meeting. I want to address what happened today, she began once everyone was settled in the common room. First, I need to apologize for the lapse in my own safety protocols. I left my bear spray with my pack, which was careless and potentially dangerous. You couldn't have known, Robert said quickly. None of us expected a bear right there in the middle of the day. Clara shook her head. That's exactly the point. We work in wild country. We should always expect that an encounter is possible at any time. My complacency put me at risk. She took a deep breath. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and today was a stark reminder that experience doesn't matter if you don't follow the basic rules every single time. The team nodded solemnly. The incident had shaken them all, bringing home the reality of their work environment in a way that No training video or protocol manual could. Tomorrow we need to decide how to proceed with our research, Clara continued. The rangers will want me to show them exactly where the encounter occurred, and then we'll need to determine if we can safely continue our survey work in that area. Should we consider relocating to another survey site? Mackenzie suggested. Maybe somewhere with less bear activity. Clara considered this. Possibly, but bears can be anywhere in the park. The issue isn't so much the location as ensuring we're all following safety protocols consistently. She looked around at each of them. From now on, bear spray stays on your person at all times in the field. No exceptions, not even for bathroom breaks. We travel in groups of at least 3, not pairs, and we increase our noise level, especially near blind corners or dense vegetation. The team agreed readily to these enhanced precautions. Get some rest, Clara concluded. We'll meet with the rangers at 8 a.m. tomorrow. As the meeting broke up, Clara remained seated, staring out the window at the darkening sky. Jason lingered behind, taking the chair across from her. You okay? He asked quietly. Clara considered the question. Was she okay? Physically, yes. Mentally, she wasn't sure yet. I will be, she answered honestly. It's just, I've always felt so at home in the backcountry. Even knowing the risks, I never really thought that it would happen to you, Jason finished. Nobody does. The door was cracking, Clara said, voicing the thought that had been recurring since the encounter. If it had hit one more time, with a bit more force. Jason nodded, not offering platitudes or false reassurances. As field researchers, they both understood the reality of the wilderness they worked in. Its beauty and its dangers were inseparable. I'm thinking of the Chamberlain study, he said after a moment. Remember, the one about near-miss experiences changing risk perception among wilderness professionals. Clara knew the research he was referencing, a study showing how wilderness workers often became more safety-conscious after near-miss events, sometimes to the point of changing career paths entirely. I'm not quitting fieldwork, she said firmly, correctly interpreting his unspoken question. No one would blame you if you wanted to scale back. Focus more on lab work or data analysis for a while, Jason suggested carefully. Clara shook her head. This research matters too much. The climate data we're collecting, the shifts in plant communities, it all tells a story that needs to be documented. She paused. But I am going to rethink some of our field protocols, and probably have a few sleepless nights. Jason nodded, standing to leave. For what it's worth, you handled it exactly right. You stayed calm, you didn't panic, you made the right decisions afterward. After Jason left, Clara remained in the common room alone, watching as the last light faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear above the jagged silhouette of the Teton Range. The mountains looked different to her now, no less beautiful but more complex, the grandeur inseparable from the wildness, the danger inherent in their untamed nature. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time Clara closed her eyes, she heard the huffing breath of the grizzly, felt the vibration of its weight against the thin plastic walls of the porta-potty. Around 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and moved to the small desk in her room, opening her laptop to review the day's collected data. The specimens they had logged, the quadrant measurements, the GPS coordinates, all seemed disconnected from the reality of her bear encounter, as if they belonged to a different day entirely. Yet this was the work that had brought her to that meadow, to that moment. The scientific pursuit that had shaped her adult life had also placed her in the path of one of North America's most powerful predators. Clara found herself opening a blank document and beginning to type, not field notes or research observations, but a personal account of the encounter. The words flowed more easily than she expected, the details vivid in her mind. Perhaps this was her way of processing, of containing the experience within the familiar structure of documented observation. By dawn, she had written several pages and felt marginally more centered. She showered, dressed, and headed to the research station's small kitchen to make coffee, finding Robert already there, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting his night had been no more restful than hers. Couldn't sleep either, she asked, reaching for a mug. He shook his head. Kept thinking about what could have happened if you'd been outside instead of in the porta-potty, if the bear had been more aggressive. He trailed off. I know, Clara said quietly, but it didn't happen that way. They were joined gradually by the others, the conversation subdued as they prepared for the day ahead. At 7:45 a.m., they loaded into the university vehicle and drove to the trailhead, where Rangers Collins and Martinez were waiting. "Good morning, Dr. Nguyen," Martinez greeted her. "How are you feeling today?" "Ready to get this done," Clara replied with more confidence than she felt. The thought of returning to the scene of her encounter brought a flutter of anxiety, but she was determined to fulfill her professional responsibilities. "We'll keep this brief," the ranger assured her. "We just need you to show us exactly where the encounter occurred and give us any additional details you might remember in context." Clara nodded. "Of course." The hike back to Lupine Meadow was markedly different from the previous day. The rangers maintained a steady conversation, their voices carrying through the forest, a deliberate practice to alert any wildlife to their presence. Clara found herself scanning the surroundings constantly, her hand resting frequently on the bear spray canister, now firmly attached to her belt. When they reached the meadow, Clara immediately noticed a park service truck parked near the porta potties. The rangers had driven up using the service road that reached this area from another direction. As they approached the facility, Clara's step faltered slightly. The blue porta potty stood as it had before, but now the damage was clearly visible even from a distance. Deep gouges in the plastic door, a significant dent in one corner, the door itself slightly ajar due to the damaged latch. "That's where it happened," she said, pointing. "I was inside the middle unit when the bear approached." The rangers nodded, taking photographs of the damage. "Can you walk us through the encounter again, now that we're here?" Martinez asked. Clara recounted the experience once more, her voice steady despite the unsettling feeling of standing where the bear had been just a day earlier. She pointed out the direction from which the bear had appeared and the path it had taken around the structure. And after damaging the door, it just lost interest and wandered off in that direction, she concluded, indicating the eastern edge of the meadow. Ranger Collins made notes while Martinez examined the damaged door more closely. "Consistent with investigative behavior," he commented. "No sign of predatory intent or food conditioning, just curiosity about an unfamiliar object and sense." They spent about 20 minutes at the site, the rangers documenting the damage and taking measurements of the claw marks to help identify the specific bear. Clara answered their questions with scientific precision, finding that the professional context helped distance her emotionally from the experience. "We've got what we need," Martinez finally said. "The maintenance team will replace this unit. Later today, we'll continue monitoring for bear activity in this area, but based on tracking, it appears the individual has moved about 3 miles east since yesterday. Do you think it's safe for us to continue our research here?" Clara asked. The rangers exchanged glances. "With proper precautions, yes," Collins answered. "Keep groups to a minimum of 3 people, make noise, carry bear spray, and perhaps avoid dawn and dusk fieldwork for the next few weeks. We don't want to unnecessarily restrict legitimate scientific research, but safety has to come first." Clara nodded, appreciative of the balanced response. As a scientist, she understood the importance of respecting wildlife while still conducting necessary research. As someone who had just experienced a frightening close encounter, she also appreciated the emphasis on enhanced safety measures. "We'll adjust our protocols accordingly," she assured them. They hiked back to the trailhead together, the conversation gradually shifting from the bear encounter to Clara's research. She explained the changing plant communities they were documenting, the shifts in bloom times and species distribution that might indicate climate impacts. "The data we're collecting here connects to similar studies across the Rocky Mountain region," she explained. "We're seeing consistent patterns of change that can't be explained by normal climatic fluctuations." The rangers listened with interest. This was the aspect of her work that Clara found most fulfilling, connecting specific field observations to larger patterns, contributing to the scientific understanding of how ecosystems were responding to human impacts. By the time they reached the trailhead, Clara felt something settling within her, not a dismissal of yesterday's fear, but a recontextualization of it. The encounter was now one element of her wilderness experience, significant but not defining. Back at the research station, Clara met with her team to discuss how to proceed. "The rangers believe we can safely continue our work with enhanced precautions," she informed them. "But I want to hear from each of you. If anyone is uncomfortable returning to that area, we can adjust our research plan." To her surprise, the team was unanimously in favor of continuing their work in Lupine Meadow. "The data sequence is too valuable to abandon," Jason pointed out. We've been monitoring those quadrats for 3 seasons. Switching locations now would compromise the longitudinal integrity of the study. Mackenzie nodded in agreement. As long as we strengthen our safety protocols, I'm comfortable continuing. Same here, Robert added. Yesterday was eye-opening, but it was also a reminder of why this research matters. We're documenting ecosystems that include apex predators. That's part of the whole picture. Clara felt a surge of pride in her team's professionalism and dedication. All right then, we'll continue with modified protocols. Groups of 3 minimum constant noise, bear spray on person at all times, and we'll avoid early morning and evening fieldwork for now. They spent the rest of the day reorganizing their research schedule and reviewing the data they'd collected before the encounter. By evening, they had a solid plan for resuming their survey work the following day. That night, Clara sat on the small porch of the research station, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. The air was cool and sharp, with the scent of pine. In the distance, she could hear the haunting call of a great horned owl. For the first time since the encounter, she felt the familiar sense of peace that had drawn her to this work originally. The wilderness was neither malevolent nor benign. It simply was. The grizzly that had investigated the porta potty wasn't motivated by aggression or malice, just the natural curiosity and instincts that governed its existence. Clara touched the bear spray canister that she'd placed on the table beside her, a new habit she suspected would remain with her for a long time. She respected the bear's power and wildness, but she would not let fear drive her from the work that mattered to her. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Clara's team assembled at the trailhead at 9 a.m., later than their usual start, to avoid the dawn hours when bears were often more active. Everyone wore small bells attached to their backpacks, a simple noise-making precaution that would reduce the chance of surprising wildlife. Everyone has their spray accessible, not buried in packs, Clara confirmed, her own canister prominently attached to her belt. The team nodded, displaying their bear spray canisters. Today we'll stay together as one group rather than splitting up, Clara continued. We'll focus on completing the southern quadrant survey we had to abandon day before yesterday. They hiked in together, maintaining conversation at a volume that would alert any wildlife to their presence well in advance. When they reached Lupine Meadow, Clara noticed that the damaged porta potty had already been replaced with a new unit. The ordinary blue plastic structure stood as if nothing had happened, though Clara would never look at such facilities quite the same way again. The team worked efficiently, completing their survey of the southern quadrant by early afternoon. Clara found herself constantly scanning their surroundings, a new hypervigilance that both reassured and disturbed her. She had never been careless in the wilderness, but now she felt a heightened awareness of every sound, every movement in her peripheral vision. As they worked, a few hikers passed through the meadow on the main trail. Clara noticed how her team tensed slightly at each new human presence before relaxing again. The encounter had affected all of them, reshaping their perception of their workplace in subtle but permanent ways. By late afternoon, they had completed the planned survey work and were packing up their equipment. The day had been productive, with no wildlife encounters beyond a distant herd of elk grazing at the meadow's northern edge. "Good work today," Clara said, as they prepared to hike back. "I think we've established a solid protocol moving forward." The team nodded, a quiet sense of accomplishment replacing some of the tension they'd carried throughout the day. They'd returned to the site of Clara's frightening encounter and reclaimed it as a place of scientific inquiry rather than fear. The hike back was uneventful. As they approached the trailhead, Clara found herself walking beside Mackenzie, who had been unusually quiet throughout the day. "Everything okay?" Clara asked. Mackenzie hesitated before responding. "I've been thinking about what happened to you, how it could have been any of us." "That's true," Clara acknowledged. "It's made me question whether I'm cut out for this kind of fieldwork long term," Mackenzie admitted. "I love the research, the ecosystems, but the reality of working in grizzly territory," she trailed off. Clara considered her response carefully. As a mentor and team leader, she wanted to be supportive without either dismissing Mackenzie's concerns or reinforcing them unnecessarily. "Valid concerns," she said finally. "The risks are real, but they're also manageable with proper precautions." She paused. "Take some time to process before making any decisions. This work is important, but not worth doing if the fear outweighs the fulfillment." Mackenzie nodded thoughtfully. "How are you so calm about going back there after what happened?" Clara smiled slightly. I'm not as calm as I appear, but I've spent most of my adult life in these ecosystems. They're where I feel most connected, to my work, to the larger patterns we're studying. She looked toward the mountains rising before them. One frightening encounter doesn't erase 20 years of profound experiences. They completed the hike in companionable silence, Clara reflecting on her own words. She had spoken truthfully. The encounter hadn't erased her love for fieldwork or her sense of purpose in it. But it had changed something fundamental in her perception, a shift she was still trying to fully understand. Over the next 3 days, the team continued their survey work without incident. They maintained their enhanced safety protocols, working only during midday hours and staying together as a single group. No further bear sightings occurred in their research area, though rangers reported that several bears remained active within the general vicinity, including the grizzly that had likely been involved in Clara's encounter. On Friday afternoon, as they completed their final survey of the week, Clara found herself standing at the edge of Lupine Meadow, looking out over the golden grasses rippling in the wind. The Teton Range stood sharp against the blue sky, peaks already dusted with early autumn snow. Robert joined her, following her gaze to the mountains. Quite a first week of fieldwork, he commented with a wry smile. Not our typical orientation, I'll admit, Clara replied. Are you reconsidering your research placement? He shook his head. Actually, no, as frightening as it was, even secondhand it was also. He searched for the right word. Clarifying. This is real wilderness, not just a scenic backdrop for data collection. Clara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. That's a healthy perspective. As they hiked back to the trailhead for the last time that week, Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at completing the week's work safely, lingering anxiety from her encounter, pride in her team's resilience, and beneath it all a deeper appreciation for the wild nature of the place they studied, not as an abstraction or a data point, but as a living reality. Back at the university campus in Laramie the following Monday, Clara sat in her office reviewing the field notes and data they had collected. The familiar academic environment felt jarringly different from the wilderness where they had gathered this information. Here, surrounded by books and computers, the encounter with the grizzly seemed almost dreamlike, despite the vivid memories that still disrupted her sleep. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Clara looked up to see Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the department chair, standing in the doorway. "Got a minute?" Eleanor asked. "Of course," Clara replied, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Eleanor sat down, her expression concerned. "I heard about what happened in Grand Teton. Are you all right?" Clara nodded. "I'm fine, shaken still, but unharmed." "The incident report came through official channels this morning," Eleanor explained. "Pretty frightening reading." It was frightening. "Living it," Clara acknowledged with a tight smile. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Clara, I want you to know that if you need to adjust your research schedule, focus more on lab work or data analysis for a while, the department will fully support that decision." "I appreciate that," Clara said, "but I don't think it's necessary. We've already established enhanced safety protocols, and the rangers consider the area safe for research with proper precautions." "This isn't about administrative concerns," Eleanor clarified. "It's about your well-being. Near-death experiences have a way of lingering." Clara started to object to the characterization, then stopped herself. Wasn't that exactly what it had been? If the bear had been slightly more determined, if the plastic door had given way completely. "I'm processing it," she admitted, "but I don't want to step back from fieldwork. The data we're collecting is too important, especially with the accelerating climate impacts we're seeing in the subalpine zones." Eleanor nodded, not pushing further. "Just know the option is there. No one would question your commitment if you needed some time." After Eleanor left, Clara turned to her computer and opened the folder of photographs from their field research. The images showed quadrats filled with wildflowers, GPS markers placed beside particular plant specimens, the team working methodically against the backdrop of the Teton Range. Nothing in these images captured the visceral reality of the wilderness they worked in, the sounds, the smells, the unpredictable nature of life and death in these ecosystems. She found herself opening a new document and typing "Bear Encounter Analysis," a title that made the experience sound clinical and distant. Perhaps that was what she needed, to examine what had happened through the same analytical lens she applied to her research data. Clara began listing the factors that had contributed to the encounter and her survival. Location: porta potty near meadow edge close to forest where bears forage. Time: midday during hyperphagia period, when bears are actively foraging. Isolation: separated from team member and bear spray. Bear behavior: investigative rather than predatory. Structure: plastic. Porta potty provided barrier though damaged. Outcome: bear lost interest before breaching barrier. She stared at the list, recognizing that the scientific approach only captured the surface of the experience. It said nothing about the primal fear she had felt, the way time had seemed to slow, the visceral awareness of her own mortality. A different type of documentation was needed to process those aspects. Clara began typing again, this time a more personal narrative. She described not just what had happened, but how it had felt, the sounds, the smells, the thoughts that had raced through her mind as the bear investigated the porta potty. Writing it down seemed to give the experience boundaries, containing it in a way that made it more manageable. When she finished, Clara sat back and reread what she had written. The account was detailed and emotionally honest. She considered what to do with it. Part of her wanted to share it, perhaps as a cautionary tale for other field researchers. Another part wanted to simply close the file and never look at it again. In the end, she saved the document to her personal folder and closed it. Perhaps someday it would serve a purpose beyond her own processing, but for now, it had done its job. The following weeks fell into a new rhythm. Clara's team continued their field research in Grand Teton, maintaining their enhanced safety protocols. They saw no more grizzlies, though they occasionally found evidence of bear activity: tracks in mud, scat along trails, claw marks on trees. Each sign reinforced their vigilance without triggering the acute fear that had followed Clara's encounter. In mid-October, as the first significant snowfall dusted the higher elevations, Clara's team conducted their final field survey of the season. Standing in Lupine Meadow one last time, Clara looked toward the porta potties that had been the site of her frightening encounter. The replacement unit stood unremarkable among the others, giving no hint of the drama that had unfolded there. "Penny, for your thoughts," Jason said, joining her. Clara smiled slightly. "Just reflecting on the season, it wasn't what I expected." "No," he agreed, "but the data we collected is solid. The paper on shifting bloom times is coming together, really." "Well, it is," Clara acknowledged. This was what mattered ultimately. The scientific contribution, the documentation of changing ecosystems, the small piece of understanding they were adding to humanity's knowledge. Her personal experience, while significant to her, was incidental to this larger purpose. Back on campus, as autumn deepened toward winter, Clara found herself spending more time in the greenhouse than in previous years. The controlled environment, with its regulated temperature and artificial lighting, offered a different kind of research space. Predictable, manageable, safe. She didn't acknowledge this shift consciously, framing it instead as a natural extension of the field data they had collected. The greenhouse experiments would complement the field observations, providing controlled variables that weren't possible in the wild. In late November, Clara received an email from the Grand Teton National Park Wildlife Management Division. It contained the annual bear activity report, sent to all researchers who had worked in the park that season. Scanning the document, she found a brief mention of her encounter, listed clinically as investigative behavior toward human infrastructure. No injury or property loss beyond minor damage to facility. The impersonal description struck Clara as oddly disconnecting. Her visceral, life-changing experience reduced to a single line in an administrative report. In ecological terms, it made sense. One brief interaction between species. Insignificant in the larger patterns of the ecosystem. Yet it had permanently altered her perception of the wilderness she studied. That evening, Clara found herself looking at research positions that had been posted for the coming academic year. A one-year visiting professorship at the University of Arizona caught her attention. A position focused on climate impacts on desert plant communities. No grizzlies in that ecosystem. The thought came unbidden, and Clara immediately felt a twist of shame at it. Was she really considering changing her research focus because of one frightening encounter? After 15 years studying the alpine ecosystems of Wyoming and Montana, would she abandon that expertise because of 10 minutes of fear? Clara closed the browser window without applying for the position. She wasn't ready to make such a decision. Based on emotions that were still raw, time would provide perspective. As winter settled over Wyoming, Clara's scars from the encounter became less visible but more integrated. She no longer started at unexpected sounds or dreamed of huffing, breath and cracking plastic, but she found herself making different choices, choosing greenhouse work over field planning, focusing on data analysis rather than collection methodology, mentoring students from her office rather than in the field. In January, when planning began for the next season's field research, Clara made a decision that surprised her colleagues, but felt right to her. "I'd like Jason to lead the Grand Teton surveys this year," she announced during a department meeting. "I'll be focusing on our climate chamber experiments and the meta-analysis of regional data." Dr. Eleanor Simmons raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment directly. After the meeting, she stopped by Clara's office. "Jason will do well with the experiences recently. There's some discussion about developing new protocols for remote field sites." Clara looked up with interest. "What kind of protocols?" "Enhanced communications equipment, buddy systems for even brief separations from the group, specialized training beyond the standard bear safety courses." Eleanor shrugged. "Nothing revolutionary, but a more systematic approach to the risks." "I'd be interested in contributing to that discussion," Clara said. "The standard protocols are good, but they don't fully address the psychological impact of close encounters or the subtle ways safety practices erode over time due to complacency." Eleanor smiled. "I thought you might be. I'll connect you with the working group." As winter gave way to spring, Clara found new purpose in this unexpected direction. Her experience, traumatic as it had been, offered insights that could improve safety for other field researchers. She wrote a detailed case study, anonymized but comprehensive, analyzing the factors that had contributed to her encounter and the psychological aftermath. The paper was published in the Journal of Field Research Safety, a relatively new publication, focused on practical safety protocols for scientific fieldwork in remote or dangerous environments. The response was immediate and positive, with many researchers sharing similar experiences and the gradual adjustments they had made to their work afterward. Clara hadn't given up on fieldwork entirely. By late spring, she found herself accompanying student groups on day trips to nearby mountain ecosystems, teaching plant identification and ecological survey methods. These controlled outings, with their clear boundaries and minimal risks, allowed her to reconnect with the aspects of field research she loved without triggering the anxiety that thoughts of remote backcountry still evoked. 1 year after her encounter, in early September, Clara stood in her office looking at a map of Grand Teton National Park spread across her desk. Jason's team was preparing for their autumn surveys, and she was reviewing their research plan. Lupine Meadow was marked with a red circle, survey quadrats numbered and coded by ecological zone. Clara's finger traced the familiar terrain, coming to rest near the location where the porta potties stood. The memories came, but without the visceral fear that had accompanied them for so long. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Robert, who had continued with the research project after his initial season. "Got the final equipment list for next week's trip," he said, handing her a printout. "Wanted to check if you think we're missing anything." Clara scanned the list, noting the prominent place of bear spray and communication devices. "Looks comprehensive," she said. "You're allowing enough time for the higher elevation surveys. The early snow last year compressed your schedule." "We've built in 2 buffer days," Robert assured her, "and we're starting with the highest sites to make sure we get those done before any weather moves in." Clara nodded with approval. "Good planning." Robert hesitated before turning to leave. "We all wish you were coming with us," he said finally. "It doesn't feel right, the Teton team, without Dr. Nguyen." Clara smiled slightly. "Maybe next season," she said, surprising herself with the words, "I'm not ready yet, but I'm getting there." After Robert left, Clara turned to her window, looking out toward the distant profile of mountains on the horizon. The wilderness that had been her professional home for so many years appeared different now, not diminished in its beauty or importance, but more complex in her perception of it. The grizzly that had investigated her porta potty had long since moved on, perhaps now deep in hibernation in some remote den. Clara wondered if the bear remembered their encounter at all, if it had registered in the animal's consciousness beyond a momentary curiosity about unfamiliar scents and structures. For the bear, The encounter had been incidental, a brief investigation, before moving on to more immediate concerns of foraging and survival. For Clara, it had been transformative, a pivot point that had altered her professional trajectory and personal relationship with wilderness. She turned back to the map on her desk, to the red circle marking Lupine Meadow, where wildflowers would now be fading toward autumn, where bears would be in hyperphagia again, building fat reserves for winter, where the cycle of seasons continued regardless of human observation or understanding. Perhaps that was the most profound lesson from her encounter, the humbling recognition of her own small place in these vast ecosystems, not just an observer, but a participant, subject to the same natural forces and interactions as any other species. Clara traced the contour lines of the mountains, feeling a familiar pull toward these wild places despite, or perhaps because of, their unpredictability and power. Not yet, but someday soon, she would return to the field, carrying with her both the scientific knowledge and the visceral understanding that only close encounter could provide. The bear had moved on after their brief intersection. Now, finally, Clara was ready to do the same.